Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion on how leaderless terrorism led to the attack in New Orleans with Scott Stewart. My name is Natalie Cross and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Intelligence Analysis playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Michael Auld, Program Director for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and welcome everyone to Inside Intelligence. Today, we're pleased to welcome terrorism expert Scott Stewart, who will talk about leaderless terrorism and more. He's currently a vice president of intelligence at TorchStone Global and has amassed 4 decades of analytic, investigative, and security experience, including through his former role as leader of global analysis on terrorism and security topics at Stratfor. He previously spent 10 years as a special agent involved with hundreds of investigations with the U.S. State Department. He was the lead State Department investigator assigned to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the investigations in Argentina, the bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in 1992. Scott Stewart formerly was responsible for embassy and diplomatic security in Guatemala City and Belize City and for executive protection at Dell Technologies. He's a regular contributor in the media, and his insights have been shared in the New York Times, the LA Times, CNN, NPR, Reuters, and many other outlets. He was one of the diplomatic security special agents profiled in the book, Relentless Pursuit, the DSS and the Manhunt for Al-Qaeda Terrorists by Samuel Katz. Scott, welcome to our program today. We're really looking forward to your remarks.
Thanks for having me, Michael, and thank you to the school for inviting me to speak on this important topic. It's really nice to be here with you. And I really think that the New Orleans case gives us a good opportunity to talk about leaderless resistance and kind of the history, to talk about the dynamics that drive it and some of the advantages and disadvantages of that terrorism model. But I really wanted to start with New Orleans because that was the most recent attack, just happening on the early hours of New Year's Day in New Orleans. And it really shines a spotlight on how this is not only a persistent low-level threat in the United States, but really in the past couple decades, it's been the primary terrorist threat facing those of us in the United States and in the West in general. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what happened in New Orleans. And what we had was an individual with actually a fairly normal background. He served in the U.S. military, of all things. I worked in the corporate side as an IT specialist as well. But he also ended up having some issues in his personal life. He had problems with relationships. He had some failed businesses that were not helping him. And he ended up actually going through 3 divorces, which resulted in him paying quite a bit in alimony. And the combination of that and the failed businesses really helped lead, I think, to some of his radicalization and frustration at life that kind of led him down this pathway. And as we look at what happened, it's become increasingly clear, although initially there were some reports he may have been working with others on the attack. It's become increasingly clear that he did indeed act alone. He did construct and place the bombs that he had intended to go off. And then, of course, he had rented the vehicle and really completed the entire attack cycle by himself. We saw that he did pre-operational surveillance a few months prior, riding a bicycle and walking through the French Quarter with his Google glasses or whatever they were, the camera glasses. And then even the night before the attack on New Year's Eve, a few hours before he launched the vehicular assault, he actually did a walk through the area just to kind of get an idea of what was going on and if there had been any changes and how he could proceed best with his attack, looking really at those physical countermeasures that were there and deciding how he could circumvent them. And so that those behaviors really do continue to show and highlight the importance of thinking about and analyzing attacks through the prism of the attack cycle. But when we talk about leaderless resistance, really what we're talking about is a person that is, some people like the British will call it self-initiated terrorism. A lot of times I like to call it grassroots terrorism. It's kind of the people that are disconnected, from the main group or unit. There's a lot of times no real actual connection to the group. They're really inspired by the ideology and act in accordance with that inspiration, rather than being trained at some professional terrorist camp somewhere like we would see in the old days, whether it was Libya, Iraq. I'm even thinking of the DFLP, PFLP camps in Jordan and Lebanon, or even as we saw the Al Qaeda camps, in Afghanistan back in the day. But one of the things that we've seen really over the last couple decades in the post 9/11 environment is that there has been a transition in the jihadist realm specifically away from, I shouldn't say away from, they would like to be able to launch attacks using trained cadre who have bomb making capabilities, advanced planning capabilities, surveillance capabilities, and certainly where they can operate, we still see those sorts of things happening. We see a lot more attacks happening in places like Africa. We're even seeing it in Moscow and in Russia recently, where they can act a little bit more coordinated because the authorities are not that good. But really, in the post 9/11 era, the jihadists have struggled to get these professional terrorist cadres into the United States and into Europe, and so that they've tried repeatedly, but they've just been frustrated in those efforts. And so we really saw them turning towards this concept of leaderless resistance. It was really first kind of propagated by Abu Musab al-Suri around 2004-ish, where he started talking about how jihad was an individual responsibility for every believer. And then we really saw the people that kind of launched it into the jihadist realm was Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP. And initially they started promoting it with their magazine Sada al-Malahim, where they talked about conducting these simple attacks with things that are readily available to you. And, just kill as many people as you can. Use a rock if you need to, a gun, a knife, whatever you have available. And they were actually able to inspire some attacks. And some of those were people they had contact with directly. We actually had an attack in Tennessee, or actually it was Little Rock, Arkansas, excuse me, from somebody that had been over working with AQAP, was inspired to conduct a Little Rock shooting. And then they were starting to have more luck with those kind of remote plots, like we saw happen with the Fort Hood shooting, where they had a little bit of connection. And so we saw AQAP at that point, Anwar al-Awlaki and some of the other planners decided, hey, this is really an approach that could work for us. And in 2010, they actually went big with the idea and launched Inspire magazine. And the whole concept of Inspire magazine was to really help with the radicalization and the inspiration, and then of course to be able to operationalize people to conduct these attacks. And so we saw them providing manuals on how to build pressure cooker bombs and pipe bombs, and we saw those replicated in attacks in the United States and elsewhere. I mean, the Boston Marathon bombers, for example, built their pressure cooker bomb based on an Inspire magazine model. After seeing how this was working for AQAP, we actually saw the Al Qaeda core jump onto it a little bit later, about 2011, and we saw Adam Gaddan, who was this American Al Qaeda follower, started talking about, hey, just go to a gun show, buy a weapon, and start shooting people. As the Islamic State was launched, they also then kind of spun off and grabbed onto that. And really, I believe the Islamic State has been the most successful organization in the jihadist realm as far as inspiring those kind of attacks. and we've seen them really across the globe, including this most recent one in New Orleans. And so, it's something that they've been promoting, and they've been using it, there again to get around the security cordon really that's been placed around Europe and the United States that's preventing them from these kind of attacks. However, I think it's important to understand that the idea of leaderless resistance is really kind of old. And the first kind of model of it, I think, evolved during the anarchist phase of terrorism, early terrorism, before the turn of the 20th century. And so we saw, for example, the assassination of President William McKinley by a lone gunman who was an anarchist. He got into the ideology through reading these printed broadsides that Emma Goldman and these other anarchist ideologues would print and distribute. But really, when it comes to the modern idea of leaderless resistance, I think that probably the best articulation of it was done by Louis Beam, back in the early 1980s. And he talked about it really and formalized it. That was the other part, is he really kind of gave it a structure and a terminology that we could use. So in Beam's concept of leaderless resistance, you really had two layers. You had what he called the organs of information, which were the ideologues. So it was people like him, people like William Pierce, some of the other white supremacist ideologues, and they were meant to use their First Amendment rights, their freedom of speech, to basically outline grievances, to denounce enemies of the movement, and then actually even suggest targets through those denunciations, and then provide instruction to the second layer, which was supposed to be disconnected by an air gap. It's supposed to be firewalled, and then those were the lone operators and the phantom cells that would go out and conduct these attacks. And so the idea was that you have the illegal activity happening on the second level, and it couldn't be connected to the first level that could take them down. On that white supremacist side, in the 70s, we saw the ideologues, people, and even like James Mason out of Siege, but also William Pierce out of the National Alliance. He had written a kind of a serial fictional account of how to put together a terrorist organization. He later cobbled it together into a book that was called the Turner Diaries. And, it wasn't just bad fiction. It was really meant to be a blueprint on how to construct a clandestine terrorist organization to conduct attacks. And that was really the intent there. However, in 1987, a whole group of white supremacist leaders was actually indicted for sedition in Fort Smith, Arkansas, based upon the actions of the Order and some other people who had basically been trying to follow, that Turner Diaries model, and had been robbing banks and killing people, and then providing money back to some of the ideologues. So they didn't stay totally air gapped, like Beam had suggested. Unfortunately, they were all acquitted of the seditious conspiracy charges. But one of the things that came out of the trial is that these leaders realized how thoroughly penetrated their organizations were by the FBI, by the state police, by local law enforcement. And that really caused a lot of paranoia and fear, and also launched a lot of them onto the road of really embracing leaderless resistance, including Beam and Pierce. And it's no mistake, after Fort Smith, Pierce came out with a second book, and everybody knows about the Turner Diaries, but nobody really focuses on Hunter. And Hunter was his second book, and that was the book that basically talked about how to be a successful lone wolf, or I like to call them stray mutts, but lone attacker terrorist. And he saw that as being the real model you needed to use because of the efficiency and effectiveness of law enforcement in the United States. And so we kind of had that going on for many years on the white supremacist side. The other thing that was happening about this same time, in the wake of the Fort Smith trial, is we started having the invention of the internet. And that really made this type of terrorism much more available. In the old days, you would really have to search pretty hard to find some of the material that these people were putting out. I mean, sometimes you could buy some of the books and some of the magazines and stuff at gun shows, or maybe some other outlets, but it was really difficult to kind of get into and to find this stuff. But with the internet, all of a sudden, it just opened a huge expansion for them to start publishing their stuff. I mean, even in the very early days of the internet, they were getting into these chat rooms and IRC channels and stuff, and starting to talk there, but also promote their ideology and try to get it out to others. I think back to the 80s. I was working protective intelligence for Nelson Mandela, and we were very concerned on the white supremacist side. And I remember, just to try to think if there was any mention of him by some of these people, I would have to call up Tommy, using a payphone, by the way, not my office phone at the State Department, but I have to call up Tom Metzger's answering machine, where he would publicize like his rants every week. And so I was always worried about Mandela, so I wanted to see if they were going to mention him on Metzger's rant. But now with the internet, all of a sudden, they went from these, obscure shortwave radio broadcasts and maybe a little bit of cable TV stuff, but they could get everywhere. And so we saw, and we saw just a real embrace, these not only groups like the National Alliance and Aryan Nations and such, but then we saw kind of broader movement networks and websites like Stormfront, like Vanguard News Network, et cetera, where you had just a wide array of the white supremacist movement. And then, of course, we saw the same thing happening at the jihadist side, right? We saw Azam.com show up, and some of these other jihadi websites. The anarchists, too, also followed suit of really adopting this as a way to get their message out, along with a lot of the single issue terrorists. We really saw the Earth Liberation Network, Animal Liberation Network also embrace that model, where you would have somebody like that Craig Rosebrough up in Oregon, who ran everything for ALF, Animal Liberation Front, but then Earth Liberation Front. But then he wouldn't have any connection with the people that were conducting the arsons and the bombings and such. So they were also getting into that same leaderless resistance mode. So when we think about leaderless resistance, I was talking to Michael earlier, and I tell him that when I think of the U.S. government, I think of it like a great white shark. It is just this incredible machine with these sensors. And if it can lock onto a fish out in the ocean, it's going to gobble up that fish and shred it. And I think that's what the organized terrorist groups have found. So the idea with leaderless resistance is instead of having the one big fish that's maybe has some connections that they can follow this organization, that their idea is to have bait fish. So it's this whole school of bait fish. And so they just try to have, these individual attackers, these stray mutts fit in with this whole shoal of bait fish. And then it's very difficult for the government to figure out which one is a threat and which one isn't. And that's why, very, very often, everybody gets very critical on the government. They say, oh, yeah, it's another known wolf. They knew about this person. He had shown up on the radar. Yeah, but he was one of 100,000. It's really easy to put puzzle together when you have the picture and you know what the box looks like and you have the framework. You can kind of put those pieces together. But really in the counterterrorism realm, what they're trying to do is put together a puzzle when you don't have the reference picture, you don't have a framework, and you've got thousands of puzzle pieces mixed together from different puzzles. And it's a very, very big challenge. But that's also really the advantage of leaderless resistance. You don't have the travel, the communication, the fund transfer, those things that the U.S. government and other governments can collect on, analyze, and piece together. So just by having the broadcast go out from the extremist influencers, you don't really know who's taking all that on board, who's becoming radicalized, and who's going to act it out, because you don't have the connection in many cases. Now, we have seen several cases where you do have that connection, and those have been picked up. We've seen a lot of sting operations, or where we have somebody who's a grassroots person, a self-directed terrorist, wants to try to reach out to somebody in the movement, and they fall into a sting trap, sting operation. That's been very good. So really the obscurity, really the operation security, right? It's very hard to break into that when it's a one-person cell. You can't place an informant inside of one person. But the drawbacks on the other side are that generally these people don't have professional terrorist tradecraft, and so they tend to struggle to conduct attacks. They tend to be pretty awkward. And many times what we've seen again is they will tend to want to conduct attacks that are way above their capabilities. And so we've seen many people kind of stumble into sting operations when they're trying to obtain things like, car bombs. Hey, I need a car bomb. Can you? Oh, and the FBI is like, oh yeah, we'll get you a car bomb. And so they end up in these stings, or the people that are trying to buy grenades and automatic weapons and all that stuff, just because they think they need these things, and they really don't understand that they could do just as much damage with the semi-automatic rifle as they could with the fully automatic rifle, that they could buy with no problem. So anyways, that's one of the problems. The other thing is that you really don't have any control over who you're attracting, what their capability is, and then you can't control what they're doing and what their operations are. You can't control what they're going to target. So as the movement, as the ideologue, they do give you kind of a reach that you don't have otherwise, but it's totally out of your control, and that's a disadvantage, but because you can't steer and direct them to where you would really like to have an attack happen. I think it's also important, and I guess I touched on it a little bit, but I just want to emphasize here that when we think about leaderless resistance, it's really an admission by these movements of impotence. Okay, it's saying we can't do this. There's that saying, those who can do. Well, those who can do, those who can't have to ask somebody to do it for them. And that's really what I see leaderless resistance being, in this current form. It's asking other people to do things you can't out of frustration. And so it's really that the concept of weakness. However, there is it is a continuing problem. It is going to be persistent. And we see even the ideology, right? The ideology is persistent. There's still, Anwar al-Awlaki's been dead a decade, but we still see his sermons out there being propagated. The Bin Laden stuff. A lot of things from these extremist influencers can live on the internet and continue to influence people. And I think that's also a concern. In addition to the fact that these algorithms, really bring people down the rabbit hole. So, there again, in the old days, you would have to really search to find this material. Today, just from your computer, from your phone, from your iPad, if you're on the social media, it's just going to continue dragging you down that rabbit hole into more extremist material. So I do see that this is going to continue to be a problem going forward.
Scott, thanks very much. Let's a few questions from me, and I'd love to get some questions from the audience. Remind everyone you can put your question in the chat or the Q&A function. Let's go back to New Orleans attack. Jabbar, who conducted it, and you point out that he was conducting the whole attack cycle by himself. Do you think there would have been much of a chance for law enforcement or anyone in part of all the fielders of the great white shark to have picked up on Jabbar before he carried this out?
Going back to my bait fish analogy, I think it's very difficult. But one of the things that I would like to stress here, and for this audience, and really for the society at large, right? When we have grassroots operatives like this, what we really need is grassroots defenders. And like in the school shootings, like in other attacks we've seen, workplace violence shootings, there's almost always leakage. There's almost always indicators. And there's almost always attack cycle behavior that can be seen. And so if people kind of chuckle at the see something, say something, but it works. And we've seen example after example here and abroad where people have seen something, they've reported it, and then it's resulted in an attack being thwarted.
That would be it would be good for the public, frankly, this is an editorial on my part, to know more about how this works. You know, that the success stories, which I don't think the US government has been very good at publicizing, frankly, in recent years. But okay, there's end of editorial. Yeah, next question is on the FBI's response to New Orleans. And it was very interesting to me that the initial public response was that this was not a terrorist attack, at least, and that was the assistant
Special agent in charge.
The special agent in charge and made that announcement. That's usually not the FBI's MO, to my opinion. But why do you think that they were so quick to say that?
I honestly, it's been since by that time they knew about the flag that he was flying behind his truck and the symbolism there. So I don't know how you see that and how you jump to the fact that this is not terrorism. I think that's also, why that agent got into a lot of hot water.
Well, how significant do you think it was? I mean, getting back to what motivated Jabbar, right? You mentioned a lot of things that were going on in his life, negative things. I think that they mentioned in one of his posts early on was that he had intended actually to kill his family. And that, so murder was basically in this guy's heart, no matter how he was going to achieve that. Is this often the case with attackers like this? Is that they don't start with do they start with the murder and then move to the ideology, or what do you think?
I think it can go that way. There again, Tom Metzger had a pretty interesting saying back in the day. He said that it's easier to racialize a radical than it is to radicalize a racist. Kind of, in that whole thing, violence that wants to commit violence, it's easier to racialize them than it is to, get just a racist to conduct a violent attack. So I think there's definitely a degree of that. And we see some of these people where they kind of have a smorgasbord of ideologies that they kind of pick from. I mean, they'll be kind of quasi white supremacists, quasi incel, they'll kind of have that salad bar approach of taking a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
Sometimes they go from one opposite group to the next.
Absolutely.
Maybe out of a sense of needing some belonging. But I think we don't seem to think that organized groups really have much to do with this type of phenomenon we're seeing, right? By definition, it's leaderless.
Well, yeah, I mean, they have something to do in that they are consciously promoting it and trying to use it to make themselves. And that's the interesting thing. Actually, I saw we had a question come in about New Orleans and if Islamic State had claimed it per se. They didn't basically claim it, but they acknowledged it and encouraged more people to take similar actions elsewhere, kind of globally. So they will embrace these people. They'll kind of, call them, warriors of the Islamic State or whatever instead of members. But they don't, there is a difference there and a qualitative difference on what the attacks are.
Let's talk now about, I just want to mention the connection, potential connection was initially believed reasonably that there might have been something with Las Vegas, the Las Vegas attack, which occurred about the same time. And there was a lot of superficial similarities noted in the media before that. What do you think the big differences were between those two?
Well, I believe the big difference was really intent, in that I don't really see Las Vegas as being an attack per se. It was an incident, and I really view it as being more of an elaborate suicide. This is somebody that had a great deal of training. Now, just because you're in the military doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have advanced terrorist tradecraft. As a matter of fact, I think advanced terrorist tradecraft really maps closer to what you would have as an intelligence officer, because you have to be able to have clandestine communications, travel, have to be able to do your logistics and finance clandestinely. You have to do the good surveillance without being busted. And a lot of military guys don't have those capabilities. But still, as a senior Green Beret with combat experience, he could have killed a lot of people had he wanted to. I mean, just going in with, with weapons blazing. So I really view that more as an elaborate suicide meant to draw attention to his, conspiracy beliefs rather than an attack.
There hadn't been an attack like New Orleans of that scale in several years in the US. I mean, I think that's a fair, or at least a terrorist attack.
Mhm.
And getting back to our shark analogy here, do you see that federal authorities have been largely effective? Or is this just a low level? Or we're just dealing with low numbers to begin with? Do you see what my point is?
Yeah, no, I think that one of the things we have to see with some of these with some of the attacks, um, this is an instance where I think he got really lucky and happened to have the right set of circumstances to make it more deadly than normal, if that makes sense. I mean, I really saw the same thing with the truck attack in Nice, France, the
Right.
Bastille Day attack. It just happened to have the right weapon, right time, right target. And so that was very, very deadly because of that. Not really because the perpetrator was uber skilled. And I think that that's kind, or even the Pulse nightclub. I think that's another example of just right place, right time, right weapon. Um, you know, but so I think that there were a number of things that contributed to the death count and the injury count there. That wasn't necessarily his capability. It was just kind of being in the right place, right time. But certainly, this is a continuing problem. And like I was saying earlier, it's not just the jihadis we have to worry about, but it's really the white supremacists. It's going to be the anarchists, and I kind of what we were chatting about before the call. I'm really concerned right now with kind of this, I guess, anti-capitalist. It's not really quite anarchist, although some of the anarchists may be kind of bleeding in there. That we saw happen after the Brian Thompson murder in New York in December, with all these just calls for killing more CEOs, and really the fact that they turned the killer's name now into a verb. We're going to Luigi this executive. So I'm really concerned we're going to see kind of a contagion effect, and we're going to see more of these ideological killings of CEOs and other executives.
And that was a question from one of our listeners today was, how do we see that playing out? Thank you for answering it. About the attacks in the U.S. in general, I was going back to look and see what was 2024 like. We actually had a pretty reasonably light year in terms of terrorist attacks in 2024. Fortunately, there was a number of incidents that were broken up by the FBI due to informants. How do you react to that, Scott? What do you think about, I mean, is this effective law enforcement, first of all?
Yes, I believe it is, and I believe it, and I do think that there is becoming more awareness out there of the need to report this kind of behavior, and hopefully again, in the wake of New Orleans, we're going to start seeing more vehicle rental places, being more conscious of people coming in and trying to rent vehicles, just as we've seen more awareness in guns shops. More awareness in chemical supply companies with people trying to obtain bomb making components as well. So I think that the awareness is helping in addition to the law enforcement efforts.
Okay, let's go to some questions that we have in the chat. Claire asked, do you have any examples of successful disruptor influences at the local level? Examples that could encourage local officers and prosecutors to be able to flag the individual as a possible domestic terrorist threat?
Oh yeah, 100%. There have been cases where people reported bomb making activity. They heard some suspicious explosions, reported them to the cops. The cops investigate, find a storage. And I think this one was, and I'm sorry, I'm coming off the top of my head without the research, but this one was, I think, in Minnesota. This kid had been popping some devices, I think, in a park, and somebody reported. The cops rolled up and they found all this bomb making material like in a storage space, and were able to kind of avert that. There have been other accounts of people. We actually had another attack into the Fort Hood area that was thwarted when a guy at a gun store reported somebody coming in and trying to buy a bunch of smokeless powder for pipe bombs, right? He was obviously trying, but he knew nothing about reloading. And so the guy at the gun store reported it to the cops. The cops investigated, and they thwarted an attack that was meant to hit a restaurant where off-duty servicemen and women gathered. So that was just another example. And there's a lot of other cases where people have also reported folks who were then engaged online, and then they ended up getting caught up in these sting operations.
A lot of people like to announce or to talk about what they're planning.
Yeah, there's that leakage, and there's almost always leakage in these cases.
Kevin asks, any comments or thoughts on early identification deterrence? Is automation or AI helping identify real threats? Any work towards identifying common root causes, et cetera, that might lead to radicalization?
Yeah, actually, there's when we talk about that, one of the places where we've seen that kind of AI helping a lot is not only in kind of pattern analysis stuff, but even with CCTV right now. There's some really cool features in some of the CCTV systems where you can set it up to look for certain behaviors, and the AI will alert you, and then certain behaviors in certain areas. So especially if you're looking for somebody to conduct surveillance, say on your principal or against your company, you can go out and if you've done surveillance, it's not hard to figure out where what we call the perches, where the perches would be that they would have to set up to watch, and do surveillance against your protectee or your company principal. And so you can use a lot of these cameras to alert you when there's activity in those potential perches that you can kind of then follow up. And it's much more effective than the old days where you'd have, one security guard sitting there with 80 television screens and they can't pay attention to everything. So right now, a lot of those AI tools are really helping make security more effective by pulling out activities. Now, some of it's still in development. There's some pretty cool detection software out there right now for guns that can help, see guns on people. And some of that's coming along. I think it's going to take a little bit more to really perfect it, but I see that also as another way to really help interdict and use AI to interdict. In addition to things like going through a lot of the tools that my team uses right now when we're doing social media monitoring, looking for threats against our clients. A lot of those have a component of AI that can help us comb through just the mountain of references to our clients every day. Of course, right now, especially, they still require, for the most part, a human analyst, right? Because it's one thing to say, "Oh yeah, Michael Art is killing it on this podcast," and they, so to kind of put the context there on one, some of those comments, you still need the human mind, but still the AI can bring it up to the analyst so they can pay attention to it, and that's a huge help.
But back to New Orleans, Loy is asking about the timing of this attack happening of course, on January 1st in the wee hours. But the Super Bowl is also going to be held in New Orleans. Do you think, was he perhaps planning on maybe the Super Bowl, or how concerned should we be about security for the Super Bowl?
Well, I think that in many ways, as unfortunate as this attack was, it really is going to do a big service to the Super Bowl, because those gaps and really the lack of physical security measures to stop the vehicular assault that allowed this to be so successful, that's not going to happen again. So that cat's out of the bag, and the officials in New Orleans are going to do a much better job at protecting the Super Bowl and the crowds around the Super Bowl than happened on New Year's Day.
I think it's Abigail here asked about the incels and the increase of radicalization of young men on the internet. How prevalent a problem is this? Is there any preventive measures for radicalization, something like that?
Oh man, yeah. Well, I mean, the thing, we talk about the pathway to violence, right? And we talk about that grievance and then going to violent ideation and the planning. The thing is, once you start to see those grievances and the grievance collectors, once you start to see violent ideation, there is that opportunity, especially if you know the person, it's a family member, a coworker, something like that. There are opportunities to intervene along that pathway to violence and turn it around. It's not always a one-way progression. A lot of times you can turn that pathway to violence around and prevent them from getting up to the attack. So certainly, whether it's a school shooting situation, whether it's an incel, there is the possibility there. But of course, you have to know who they are. You have to have kind of that relationship to be able to get the help to them. But I do see, and quite honestly, I think that there's a lot of overlap between kind of that the incel ideology and sexual frustration with both the white supremacist and the jihadist realm. And I think that a lot of kind of the anger and acting out that goes on both of those specifically, it has a lot to do with sexual frustration. And so there really is not a huge leap, I think, in many cases between incels and white supremacists or incels and jihadis.
Want to get to a question from Lauren, and this is getting back to what we had the January 6th event back in 2021, and obviously these individuals have been pardoned. Some of them were violent offenders. What do you see as the ramifications of that? Is that going to encourage more political violence? Will these individuals return to it? Two of the leaders, of course, were also acquitted, or also pardoned, I should say.
Yeah, I'm concerned that we really are entering into another era of contentious and potentially violent politics in the United States. This wouldn't be our first time. Remember that at one point we had a former Secretary of the Treasury get into a duel with the Vice President. We've had members of Congress whipped with canes on the floor. We've had civil wars. We had just the chaos of the 60s and 70s with all the bombings. I mean, that's the crazy thing right now. People today, maybe some of the old folks like us remember what was going on in those days. But I mean, we didn't have the 24/7 cable news or the social media back then. And so there was a lot of competition for space on the front page of the New York Times or on the CBS Evening News or whatever. And so it really only got a little bit of coverage. But there were so many bombings going on. I mean, you had, IBM headquarters being bombed, the Pentagon, the Senate, the State Department. The number of attacks and bombings that were going on are unbelievable compared to what we see today. It was, just totally off the charts. We had these groups like the Weather Underground, Los Macheteros, these other groups just, conducting all kinds of attacks. I'm afraid that we are going back into kind of another phase of that kind of violence, of anger, of frustration, of division. And in regard to January 6th, I think that in some ways, and just based upon the marches we saw of the Proud Boys on Inauguration Day in DC, I mean, that was one of the largest gatherings we've seen of the Proud Boys since January 6th. So I really believe that those actors are feeling emboldened, and I'm concerned that we're going to see the far left becoming frustrated by that. So I'm concerned we're going to see violence kind of by both sides because of that, and it's going to be kind of a spiral that feeds off each other.
In a recent book, Bruce Hoffman was talking about domestic extremism. And one of my takeaways from the book was that when federal authorities are on top of this, like you suggested at the beginning of our program, they are pretty good at keeping this thing under control, like they were with National Alliance and other groups like that. Is largely this a function of political and law enforcement will?
Yeah, and focus. And that's the other thing to remember in with everything going on today and kind of the chaos in the government. But we did have this big new focus on counterterrorism following, the 9/11 attacks. But there is kind of a pendulum swing there. We really saw, for example, the counterintelligence programs get gutted, which is something else that, the FBI is really, they only have what, maybe 11,000 agents, something in there, 11,000 agents. So if, depending where they're focused, that can have a big impact on everything that's going on what their priorities are. So yeah, it is, that focus, that political will does make a big difference. And that's also one of the reasons why when we talk about, this type of terrorism and leaderless resistance, that we don't just focus on the jihadists. They're not the only threat that's out there. We still have the threats from the far left, from the far right, from the single issue people, and now we're looking at kind of this rising anti-corporatism or anti-capitalism again, and I think that's going to also be something we need to watch for. So there's really this wide range of actors that do pose this persistent threat.
Mm-hmm. And speaking which, Kirilla asks about perhaps anti-Trump activists reacting to some of this. One thing, and I'm going to sort of riff off that point, but it struck me that Antifa had been very quiet, had its sort of heyday during the Trump years, but has been very quiet since. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, it tends to be cyclical. Mm-hmm. And as a group, like, I don't know if you remember, we were talking about like the 70s and all these other periods, but I distinctly remember in '99 how things were just really, really boiling up domestically. So we had the Battle of Seattle with all the anarchists going crazy, ripping stuff down. At the same time, in '99, we had the Summer of Hate. So we had the white supremacists burning down synagogues and murdering people in '99. And it looked like, things were starting to come to a head then. And then the 9/11 attacks kind of changed the paradigm. And we saw a lot of people that were kind of out in the extremes kind of became, focused again. And it really took the wind out of the sails of both the extreme left and the extreme right for a while, till they were able to kind of, gather momentum again.
A couple of questions, Scott, on essentially anti-corporate terrorism. One is, what warning signs should medical professionals or professionals in the healthcare industry, insurance industry look for? And do you see this as big? We have one data point right now.
Yes. Well, no, there's actually a lot more data points, because there's actually, the medical profession ends up with a lot of attacks. There's a lot of violence against practitioners, against hospitals and doctors. But really, there's kind of two frames of references that help. The one is that attack cycle. So when you don't have contact with the subject, that really the best indicators are those attack cycle behaviors. So really focusing on pre-operational surveillance, and looking for that suspicious behavior around your facilities. Now, when you have contact with the person, excuse me, that's when it's really helpful to use that pathway to violence model, because then you have communication with them. You can kind of see when they're amping up, when they're going towards violent ideation. So really, when you have contact with grievance collectors, you really need to focus on them. You need to really database their communications so that you can refer. It gives you a base of reference so you can see when they're escalating. You want to pay attention to that sort of thing. So really having a protective intelligence program that looks at those things, the attack cycle behaviors, plus the pathway to violence, can go a long way in helping you be proactive and prevent attacks.
Something I want to ask you, as a professional, has been, you've been in the private sector working on intelligence. You've been in the public sector working on it. Are public institutions, law enforcement, intelligence, unnecessarily hamstrung in what they can look at on social media in terms of trying to be anticipatory about violence?
I don't think so. I think that they have fairly free reign right now. There are some issues around encryption and some of the dark holes that leaves where you don't have a lot of visibility into what's going on. But it also brings up this whole idea, and I know there's been a lot of discussion also even in Congress about the responsibility of these apps, of these social media companies, for the content that's going on there. And right now, it seems like we are in, just a phase where moderation is going away. It is becoming increasingly difficult to get things that are inciting violence taken down. It is getting extremely difficult to have accounts suspended that are calling for violence against people. Even I have a lot of clients that have issues with imposter accounts, that people will set up imposter accounts to try to commit fraud against people who think they're the real folks. Whether that's, some of the athletes that we protect have had that happen, but also some of, like the hedge fund managers and such.
Right.
And it's difficult to get them to take down these imposter accounts. So I really do think that there is more that the social media companies can do to help as well.
There's a question on China here, and China's had a number of events lately that have been similar to what we've experienced, or Europe, in terms of this people with grievances and causing significant acts of violence, random violence. What does this tell us about the surveillance capabilities, considering China as a police state?
Well, yeah, there again, it shows that if they can't stop it,
right,
with everything they have, what can we do as a free society? And that's kind of the flip side. Think about it. They can't even stop violence or smuggling in prison. How do we expect to stop it in an open society? But certainly, China does have an issue, and some of the violence that we're seeing is due to the way they crack down, not only on minorities, whether it's the Buddhists or the Muslims, but just in large, the way that they surveil their people and kind of oppress their people's freedom of speech.
Scott, thank you very much for being with us today. This was really insightful, and certainly thank you everybody for your great questions. Look forward to talking to you again about this, and good luck in your work.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me on, everybody.